I mean, you mentioned the big five personality traits. Let's go into that next and maybe just go over what they are. And yeah.
Sure. This is such an interesting basic model that we use for personality. And it turns out when you start looking at personality traits, and this was first done by Galton in Britain back in the day, trying to understand heredity of twins. So people said, we got to understand personality traits. We need a good model. Well, where would they be? Where do we find these traits? And people discovered, I mean, this is Galton's idea, that it's in language. If we have a trait to describe somebody like he's narcissistic or arrogant or smarmy or clever or nice or mean or whatever they are, we're going to have a word for it, a single word if it's something that's important. And so people started looking for those traits and putting them into these chunks or bins. You imagine just binning all these traits. So nice and kind and compassionate and loving, and all those will be in one bin, and creative and wacky and zany and weird will be in another bin, and we'll just bin them up. And when people did this over the years, we've come up with a model that's five bins, works pretty well. It's not magic. You can do 4, 3, 2, 1, 6, 7, 8, but 5 is a really good one. And we call those the big five because they're big, because they're big bins, not because they're anything big about the traits, they're just big bins. Those big five traits cover a large part of any personality you're going to see. I think about them as basic ingredients of any personality, any sort of specific trait. You can find, you can go in those bins and find the ingredients of it. The big five, the easiest way to remember them is they spell ocean or canoe, even though the way the psychologists usually do it is NEOAC. And to go through ocean and describe what they are, the first of these big five is openness to experience or intellectance. This has to do with sort of liking ideas or intellectance or philosophy. So your show is just very high openness, just weird ideas. Conscientiousness is more like work ethic, dutifulness, discipline. The term grit, when you hear about grit, that's really an aspect of conscientiousness. And grit, conscientiousness is what you see in the workplace. So if you're looking for good workers, you want people really conscientious. E is for extroversion. And when we talk about extroversion, we're talking about it to mean sociability. But in psychology, extroversion also includes drive or maybe ambition, energy. So there's something in there with ambition as well as just sociability. A is for agreeableness. That basically means being nice. So agreeableness has to do with kind of working with people and being compassionate. Those are the two aspects. And then, where am I? Agreeableness, and N is neuroticism. So neuroticism is the term, we use the old Freudian term, but we use this to describe this combination of anxiety, depression, and hostility. And neuroticism is what you see with most of the clinical disorders, the psychological disorders. The core construct of those is neuroticism. They have other pieces as well. So those big five traits can be used like ingredients to make anything. To make narcissism, you take this low agreeableness, antagonism, which is the opposite of agreeable. So you take somebody who's mean, low in agreeableness, and you add a bunch of this extroversion, especially drive. That's grandiose narcissism. Take somebody who's mean, and you add some neuroticism to it. So somebody's mean and they're insecure. You get more vulnerable narcissism. Does that make sense? So you can kind of use these big five traits to make any trait you want. And in the field, for us, it works a lot like a Rosetta Stone. So you're like, dude, I've got this new trait we're working on in the lab. It's this. I go, well, what's the big five profile of that trait? I go, okay, I know what your trait is. So it's a language we can use to put every trait into so we can talk to each other.
Right. I think it's worth just focusing on a bit of the detail of how these traits were kind of come up with, because I think it's really elegant. You mentioned kind of putting them into bins, but this is done kind of mathematically, right, by getting people to kind of take surveys, and I think, yeah, as you kind of mentioned, it's maybe rare or impossible to hear someone say, oh, my friend is like the nicest person I've ever met, but they're also the least kind person I've ever met. Like, that just doesn't happen. Like, we understand that there's a huge correlation there, and you can extract those correlations, right?
Right, exactly. So the way it was done mathematically was they started looking at correlations. That was the first, correlations that how these things sort of hang together, go together across people. Then they developed what was called factor analysis. This is what Thurstone did up at Chapel Hill, UNC. And what factor analysis allowed you to do is take these big patterns of correlation. So I've got 100 traits correlated with 100 traits, meaning, I don't know how much to go into this, but imagine I gave 1,000 people 100 traits each and said, rate yourself on these traits. And then I saw how much each of those ratings correlated with each other. So with a factor analysis, I can say, well, it looks like I have 100 traits, but when I look in and see if those traits hang together themselves, really it turns out to be 5 traits under there. And that's what factor analysis does. It allows you to extract the underlying factors. So that was one thing. And now we're using more network analysis and other things to try to get, and now, some more complex systems. There's stuff they're doing now is really cool and a little over my head. But a lot of this comes from factor analysis.
Right. And you mentioned that, the fact there's 5, but you could have fewer or more, right? And I think you can imagine that there's a trade-off, right? You could either say, well, I'm going to have 2 factors. I'm going to say, are you nice or are you nasty? Or I could say, well, I'm going to be a poet and have 2,000 factors and know all the nuances, right? And 5 seems to be a kind of good compromise.
Yes. The big 2 model, which I use a lot, and the big 2 look a lot like yin and yang. So there's one factor which has to do with agency, shaping the world, breaking the world, making things, building. It's a combination of extroversion and openness. It's sort of dopaminergic. And there's another factor which has to do, and sometimes we call that plasticity because it has to do with change. And there's another factor which is called stability, yin, whatever you want to call it. But it has to do with stabilizing things, have to do with being nice and calm and conscientious. And so those big 2 traits work really well for a lot of systems. Like when I study social media, I'm like, well, there's people on there that are kind of breaking stuff and adding stuff, and there are people that are trying to make it all work together. So the big 2 is really useful for that. I know work in Asia, Far East, people really got into a big 6 factor because they said, well, it's this breaking down agreeableness in Asia to bring out honesty, humility factor. This sort of humility piece is really important. So maybe if we're in Asia, we should use that model more. So people will modify it depending on the situation they're in. But that 5 is really seems to be the sweet spot for, that seems to be a good set point for everything.